Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Ignition Time. This is the second part of the episode on the permanent shift in the US economy, the permanent shift in unemployment and jobs. I've had a lot of questions from our viewers and subscribers, and a lot of our subscribers asked, why was there such a strong recovery? In other words, what led to the entire recovery from the pandemic? Now, I want to be clear, in the entire world and specifically amongst Western economies, the US economic recovery from the pandemic was the strongest of the big Western economies. Now, this was because of multiple rounds of stimulus that in total amounted to $5.2 trillion. Now, initially there were $600 stimulus checks, and then after that there were $1,400 stimulus checks, and according to data from the JP Morgan Chase Institute, these made a big difference. In fact, this was on top of many other stimulus measures, including an expanded child tax credit for families and the extension of enhanced unemployment benefits. This resulted in tens of thousands of dollars of stimulus money for millions of our fellow Americans. In fact, the Biden stimulus pushed the bank accounts of even the lowest income Americans to unexpected heights. On average, the lowest income Americans had more than twice as much in their savings accounts as they did when the pandemic began. So here's an image on your screen that represents the government payments that helped build and sustain savings, especially for lower income people. Let's take a look at the change in median weekly checking account balance since January of 2020 by income percentile. Now take a look at the darker color that represents the bottom 25% of income earners, and take a look at the lighter color at the bottom of this image, which represents the richest among us, the top 25% of income. Now, as you can see, when the stimulus checks became available in March 2020, also at the start of 2021, take a look at the bottom 25% of income earners and how their savings, their median weekly checking account balance increased substantially. Obviously, a $600 payment or a $1,400 payment goes a much longer way if you're a low income earner. And if you're a high income earner, you're probably thinking, that doesn't make a big difference. And that's actually represented in this chart, everyone. Again, take a look at the darker portion, which represents the bottom 25% of income earners. The stimulus checks resulted in a big jump in their checking account balance, and the child tax credit payments also made a big difference. Also, I want our viewers and subscribers to know the Federal Reserve, which is the US central bank that controls interest rates, also kept rates near zero and pumped hundreds of billions of dollars. By the way, this is hundreds of billions of dollars of money we didn't have into the economy. So what the Federal Reserve did, and I don't know whether you want to call this a hoax or whether you want to call this the greatest magic trick of all time, they just added trillions of dollars to their balance sheet. They just went into their computers and said, okay, we're going to add a few more zeros, and then we're going to lend that money out to the US Treasury, and then the US Treasury is going to inject that money into the US economy. I have done another video on this where I've explored what I consider to be the greatest financial magic trick in the history of mankind, thanks to Jerome Powell, the chairman of the United States Federal Reserve. So what the Federal Reserve did, combined with the stimulus measures from Congress, basically allowed Americans to start spending again. Let's take a look at this image, which represents personal consumption spending. By the way, this is the driver of the US economy, the fact that you go out there and spend money, the fact that I go out there and spend money. So the personal consumption spending rebounds past the pre-pandemic high. In fact, this represents the consumption in $2012 annualized. And you can start to see that personal consumption reduced substantially at the start of the pandemic, and then now personal consumption is higher than before. The vast majority of that spending went to purchasing goods. We're talking cleaning supplies, we're talking home appliances, we're talking food, groceries, we're talking milk, eggs. The service industry, like hotels and restaurants, saw only a small boost in spending. People spent money on the things that they needed the most. But the problem is all the spending put a lot of pressure on the entire labor market. Manufacturers struggled. food processors struggled, and the entire infrastructure that is involved in delivering goods to stores and people's homes, such as warehouses and truckers, they had huge demand for workers. You know, if you were ordering stuff on Amazon Prime prior to the pandemic, and now you get stuff in a day or two. But you know, during the pandemic, you had to wait a week, 2 weeks, sometimes longer to get stuff. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And the big factor here is that many service sector companies saw significant competition for labor. So now the big question is, why is it that people are not coming back to work? Why are people deciding, hey, I'm not going to work, I'm going to retire, or potentially just sit and wait? Well, folks, the biggest factor is safety. And there's another hidden factor, and that's retirement. In fact, there's been a significant surge in retirements along with the safety threat associated with COVID and then with Delta and now with Omicron. By the way, COVID killed more Americans in 2021 than it did in 2020, despite the fact that we have the vaccine. And so this is another subject. The hesitation about vaccines, I think, has a huge role to play in the deaths we're seeing in 2021. A majority of the people dying in 2021 are those who are unvaccinated. So the hesitation about the vaccine is killing more Americans in 2021 than it did in 2020, even though we have a vaccine in 2021, which is a huge irony and the huge tragedy of this situation. So let's take a look at this image. Why Americans said they did not work. The main reason for not working in the last 7 days amongst respondents under the age of 75. The orange represents the pandemic impact on employers. In other words, closures, layoffs, furloughs, and reduction in businesses. So you can start to see the orange essentially is employer related, and that's playing a small role. Retired, you'll see that magenta line, which represents people who retired. More and more people are retiring. Now, there's an interesting correlation here with COVID. You can start to see that red line closer to the bottom. In other words, you had COVID or cared for a patient who had COVID. That's playing a role. Childcare has been playing a role, and you see the gray section that represents simply didn't want to. So you can start to see how challenging this whole situation is. Now, transportation problems play a big role. Taking care of an elderly person, concern about getting or spreading COVID are not shown on this image due to inconsistent survey measures. So, folks, this is a very, very complex subject, and I'm trying my best to help our viewers and subscribers make sense of this. Here's a quote from Daniel Zhao, who's an economist at Glassdoor. I think many economists and forecasters in 2021 continually predicted that this month people would suddenly explode back into the labor force, whether it's because of vaccines or the summer or schools reopening. That has fundamentally not happened. So you can start to see how uneven this recovery has been and how this has resulted in a permanent shift in behavior for the American economy, for the average American worker, and also by extension, I believe, the American consumer. I believe we are at a crossroads unlike any other. I still have hope that we can emerge from this stronger as a country, stronger as a nation, because I believe we are only as strong as our weakest link. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it has taught us that we as Americans have character, have resolve, and we can prevail in any situation. If we can get through this, I believe we can get through anything, because I believe what has happened in the last year and a half is nothing short of an extended war on our country by an unseen enemy. And in many cases, I'm specifically talking to those who oppose vaccinations. I'm not talking about vaccine mandates. I'm talking about the vaccine itself. And for those who oppose vaccinations, I think you've played a role, unfortunately, in making the situation much worse. Again, I'm not talking about vaccine mandates. That's an entirely different discussion. I'm talking about my support for the vaccine itself. Thank you so much for watching. Please click like, please click subscribe, please enable notifications. I appreciate you. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode of Ignition Time. Take care. Bye.